Discover the amazing, clinically proven health benefits of original Tahitian noni. Original Tahitian noni includes powerful antioxidants, adaptogens, nutrients, and phytonutrients to naturally boost energy levels, immune system function, and overall health. Meticulously sourced from French Polynesia, this is the original superfruit. Accept no imitations. Original Tahitian noni. Visit ATR Health at alchemicaltechrevolution.com. and click on the Shop Here tab for more details.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
You're listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McRoy. Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're going to talk about Crowley in the Land of Enchantment. There's something strange and occult about the desert. And tonight we're going to be reading from a book by one Mr. Alex Owen titled The Place of Enchantment, British Occultism, and the Culture of the Modern. And we're going to be reading from a portion of this book tonight that's called Aleister Crowley in the Desert. Now, we're going to see some of the claims made by Aleister Crowley and his students and associates, those that belong to the various orders, occult orders, that Crowley was a part of, the OTO, notable among them, also the AA, or Argenteum Astrum, as it were. These were foundational organizations for many occultists in the modern era, and Crowley had a hand in both of them. Very much so. In fact, the core of their teachings are derived nowadays from the work of Aleister Crowley. Or at least that's what they'd have you believe. Now, make no doubt about it, Crowley borrowed a lot from other traditions, and he contorted the meanings of certain things in various ways, claimed to have channeled much of his writings, such as the Book of the Law. So, with that in mind, did he really channel this? Or is he just telling us that? Were these his ideas, or was there some spiritual force at play? I'll leave that up to you to discern for yourselves. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that there's a spiritual force involved. In fact, I would think there most likely is, but the nature of that spiritual force is the thing that I question the most, especially as it surrounds and pertains to Aleister Crowley and the things associated with him. And we're going to get right into this here tonight. And we'll see. This guy was sketchy at best. So, let's get into the reading here right away. Aleister Crowley in the Desert. In late 1909, two Englishmen, scions of the comfortable middle classes, undertook a journey to Algiers. Aleister Crowley, later dubbed to be the wickedest man in the world, was in his early 30s. His companion, Victor Newberg, had only recently graduated from Cambridge. The stated purpose of the trip was pleasure. Crowley, widely traveled and an experienced mountaineer and big game hunter, loved North Africa and had personal reasons for wanting to be out of England. Newburgh probably had little say in the matter. Junior in years, dreamy and mystical by nature, and in awe of a man whom he both loved and admired, Newburgh was inclined to acquiesce without demur in Crowley's various projects. There was, however, another highly significant factor in Newburgh's quiescence. He was Crowley's Chela, a novice initiate of the magical order of the Silver Star, which Crowley had founded 2 years earlier. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. That would be the Argentium Astrum. And this was about the time after he founded that organization, began putting together the mystical operational workings of that order, was coming up with his various doctrines for this, and he was introducing these things to the OTO. So these two organizations, they overlap in a lot of ways, although they claim to be separate organizations. But Crowley, ever the opportunist, jumped on board the OTO to spread around his ideas of Thelema later on here. But let's continue with the reading here. As such, Newburgh had taken a vow of obedience to Crowley as his master and affectionately dubbed Holy Guru, and had already learned that in much that related to his life, Crowley's word was now law. It was at Crowley's instigation that the two men began to make their way, first by tram and then by foot, into the North African desert, to the southwest of Algiers. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. The Southwest Desert, remember that. There's an important significance as an esoteric tie over to things that happen later on here in America. But let's continue reading here. Crowley's decision to perform there a series of magical ceremonies that prefigured his elaboration of the techniques of sex magic, or as he was later to call it, magic, spelled with a K at the end. In this case, the ceremonies combined the performance of advanced ritual magic with homosexual acts. It is this episode in the desert, sublime and terrifying as an experience, profound in its effects and illuminating in what it reveals of the engagement of advanced magical practice with personal selfhood, that constitutes the focus of this chapter. So I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So the two men went to Algiers, and they wandered about in the desert to perform some magical ceremonies and have homosexual sex, essentially. So this was Aleister Crowley. This was the person he took to be his student, his Chela, as it were, within the Argentium Astrum. Do you think maybe he was taking advantage of this younger guy for some reason or another? I don't know. I'll leave that kind of thing up to you to decide here. But let's continue on, because it only gets weirder beyond this. The Crowley life story is almost the stuff of Victorian melodrama. The good man gone bad, betrayer of women and men alike, corrupter of innocence, dark angel, and self-proclaimed Antichrist. Viewed differently, Crowley assumes tragic heroic status. This was a gifted man born into privilege, who scorned convention and ultimately destroyed himself in his relentless search for impossible truths. In the magical world that he made his own, the name Aleister Crowley evokes admiration, even reverence. Offshoots of Crowley's magical order and practitioners of his magic are to be found throughout the Western world. Just the same, from his early days in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn to the present day, Crowley has been denounced by magicians as everything ranging from an evil genius to a magical fraud. His contemporaries excoriated him as rumors of his escapades reached a wider public through reported court cases and salacious articles in the general press. Nevertheless, however, Crowley is viewed, his magical odyssey is deeply instructive of the potentialities of the psychologized magic of the fin de siècle, and illustrative of its dangers. Not least, Crowley's magical practice epitomized the ease with which the high aspirations of an order such as the Golden Dawn could metamorphose into those so-called black arts, against which occultists such as Madame Blavatsky railed. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks, and that right there is like the pot calling the kettle black, right? Madame Blavatsky didn't like Crowley. Crowley didn't care for her either. They both considered the other a type of charlatan or a type of trickster or an evil person. So I find that very interesting. Let's continue on. At an individual level, as seems to have happened with Crowley, undisciplined, psychologized magic in the hands of the ill-prepared could lead to personal disintegration. At all events, what happened in the desert might be said to have destroyed the lives of two men. It certainly crystallized the moment at which Crowley let go of what was known and could be anticipated magically, and for good or ill embraced both a lived and a magical modus operandi in which there are no safeguards and no guarantees. The episode that forms the focus of this chapter marks the point at which Crowley crossed the Rubicon in a number of senses, but the experiment was not straightforwardly self-serving, as much of his magical work was to become. Nor did it represent simply the indulgence of an exoticized and outlawed sexuality. What happened in the desert was the result of a serious, if misguided, attempt to access and explore a centuries-old magical system, and it represented an intense personal investment in the pursuit of magical knowledge. In the following discussion, the event itself is deconstructed with a view to presenting both a microanalysis of a magical rite performed in a specific context and a focused discussion of the relationship between psychologized magic and the exploration of subjectivity. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So remember the term psychologized magic. This is a very sciencey sounding term, and this is largely how much of what they call magic works, right? It affects the human mind in various ways. Human psychology. It's manipulative, let's put it that way. So let's read on here. The chapter therefore sets out to examine the meaning and significance of a particular magical work performed in a colonial context against a backdrop of fin de siècle decadence, which also getting at its immediate experiential dimensions. The episode itself provides a rare glimpse of interiorized magic in the making, although that was certainly not Crowley's intention in either his subsequent veiled allusions to the performance of the rite or his documentation of its magical effects. Furthermore, in situating the discussion within the conceptual framework implied by the term subjectively, I am stepping outside both the magical episteme and the liberal humanist conception of self upon which Crowley, in 1909 at least, depended. I am instead relying on a particular theoretical formulation of selfhood that underscores its contingency. The post-structuralist concept of subjectivity is suggestive of a self that is both stable and unstable, knowable and unknowable, constructed and unique. The central purpose of this chapter, however, is to present an analysis of a pivotal magical experience, elucidating its complexities and arguing for it in terms of an ultimate self-realization that exposed the limitations of a unified sense of self upon which experiential self-identity depends. So I'm going to pause for a moment there, folks, and I'll break down a little bit of that word salad for you. Essentially, it's the whole duality principle this guy is speaking about. He wants to show that this dual nature of mankind, this internal battle we all have with what we would call the dweller on the threshold, or the doppelganger, the Ahrimanic double within each of us. This battle of the psyche, and think of this in terms of Freudian psychology, the id, the ego, and the superego. You see, the id being the devil on your left shoulder, and the ego being the self, and the superego being the angel on your right shoulder. So when you see these, think of the old cartoons, the Tom and Jerry cartoons or whatever, where you had the little devil on the one shoulder and the angel on the other, telling him to do the right thing, and the other one telling him to do the wrong thing. We all have this type of internal battle within us. And this here is arguing about the unification of these two sides together. That's what this author of this book claims to be looking at it from in the context of. But we'll see as we get through the reading here. Crowley took a dark turn with a lot of this stuff. And this is well acknowledged. And he made claims. He made all sorts of claims to be the Messiah figure of this new age. I don't know if he used those exact terms, but essentially he saw himself as being the one to bring forward the message of the law, Thelema, as he called it. The book he wrote, the Book of the Law, presented, do as thou wilt is the whole of the law. These were the new rules for the new age. The old rules no longer applied. God's natural laws that were present from time immemorial no longer applied. Now it was all about this new law given through Aleister Crowley. Do you see the hubris here? Do you understand the spiritual implications of such an idea? But this is what he propounded over time here. And let's get a little further into the reading here, because we'll see exactly what happened here, according to these two guys, and according to the tradition brought forward by these secret society groups that carry this story forward today. The making of a magician. Aleister Crowley was born in 1875 to Edward and Emily Crowley, Plymouth Brethren of the strictest kind. He was baptized Edward Alexander, known in the family as Alec, and only later, in his ardent Celtic phase, changed his name to Aleister. The Crowley money had been made in the brewery trade, but the senior Edward Crowley had little to do with the business and lived a gentleman's existence. He was a gifted and devoted preacher, and his son adored and sought to emulate him. Conversely and significantly, the youthful Alec had no time for his mother, whom he despised and remembered treating virtually like a servant. At the age of 8, and in accordance with the dictates of his social class, Alec was sent away to school, where he continued in a pious vein. In 1887, however, his father died, and an immediate change was wrought in the boy. He began to hate his school, and while continuing to accept the theology of the Brethren, quite simply went over to Satan's side. In his Confessions, Crowley states that he could not understand the reason for this sudden identification with the forces of evil. It is possible that his claim that from the age of 12 he sought Satan's path with a passion previously reserved for the God of his father might have been a convenient authorial fiction. On the other hand, it is not difficult to speculate on the possible reasons for a switch of allegiance. The death of a father who was synonymous in the boy's mind with Christ, if not God, the fallibility of the idea of an all-powerful and just God, and so on. Crowley, perceptive and witty about the foibles of others, could apparently display an astonishing lack of insight when it came to himself. Perhaps this is why he failed to make more of the fact that it was his mother who first referred to him as the Beast, a name he was to make his own. It was she, possibly in the wake of an adolescent episode involving Crowley and a family maid, who believed that I was actually Antichrist of the apocalypse. Whatever the reasons, in a boyhood suffused with biblical imagery, Crowley seems to have made an early identification with Satan and further connection between Satan and sexuality. This was ultimately to be worked out in the magic of his adult years, and I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So Crowley, in his own writings, claimed to have this affinity towards Satan, according to this. And yet there will still be people who say, no, he was just misunderstood. He wasn't really a Satanist. Well, I got news for you. In his own words, he had an admiration for Satan. He adopted this name, the Beast. All of these things, he knowing full well, and maybe he did it as a sense of mockery. Does that really make it any less effectual in many ways? Not really, but let's continue on here. In 1895, Crowley finally overcame family opposition and went up to Cambridge University. Cambridge was a final liberation from the stultifying religious atmosphere of his home, and he gave himself over to the 3 prescribed joys of sex, smoking, and literature. Already adept in Latin and Greek, Crowley abandoned work for the moral science tripos and spent his time in an intensive study of English literature, supplanted by French literature and the classics. It was at Cambridge that he first read Richard Burton's Arabian Nights and began to acquire an extensive library, including valuable first editions. Crowley adopted a luxurious lifestyle, but he was also reading voraciously. Won distinction in the game of chess and began to write and publish verse. Like other young men of his class, he sought amours with working-class girls in Cambridge. He found these encounters intoxicating, but beneath the surface, his attitude towards the female sex was ambivalent. Crowley later espoused liberated views on the subject of women, recognizing female sexuality and denouncing the sexual double standard in favor of mutual sexual abandonment. There remained, however, an undercurrent of fear, resentment, and contempt. His tendency to throw himself into passionate romantic entanglements with women was paralleled by an equal facility for discarding them when his needs altered or attention wandered. This single-minded ruthlessness was a feature of his personality and affected both women and men, but it nevertheless remains the case that Crowley left behind a trail of devastation when it came to the women in his life. Alcoholism, insanity, and suicide followed in his wake, and the suggestion that he deliberately sought out borderline or unbalanced women because they could better access the astral plane remains highly questionable. And I'm going to pause for a moment right here, folks. So this guy was a total narcissist. By definition, Crowley was a narcissist. He was a psychopath. He was a sociopath. You see, by definition, if you look at exactly what he's admitted to here and what's admitted of him, he was one of these people who seek power over others, much like those in positions of power today in this world. These dark occultists that run things, this is their template, this is how they operate. Largely, they are narcissists, they are vampires of sorts, they are psychopaths, sociopaths. They have this self-serving type of personality, as it were, here, much like Crowley did. And sometimes they seek out mentally unstable people to further their ends and usually lead them down a dark road. This is formulaic within many of these occult fraternities, folks. This is what winds up getting advanced through the occult fraternities. They're not these enlightened masters as they claim to be. They're not these folks that advance and elevate spiritually to the great beyond, to the great white brotherhood, and reach back down through the hierarchy and guide humanity to future evolution here. That's not who these folks are at all. As attested to right here by this. This is one of their poster children, Aleister Crowley. This is the one that's been identified with much of the modern occult movement. He's had a profound effect on modern occultism. And there's still people that will defend him, even within these secret organizations, especially within them, and say he was a brilliant magician, and that he was one of the most powerful magicians ever, and that he crossed the abyss, and he advanced to become a secret chief, to become one of these lofty, exalted, highly regarded, enlightened masters. They'll still make these claims today, even looking at his sordid history here. But see, that's where this all leads to. And this is wherein lies a problem with a lot of this stuff, because even though you can learn some valuable things about natural forces, about the nature of reality, about how these energetic principles affect humankind in many different ways, all these secrets they've kept hidden from us just for the purposes of control, you also see they always have this narcissistic personality. This type of personality where they don't care who they hurt. It's all about them, advancing them, drawing more power unto them, right? And this is just one facet of this. If you look at the magical side of it, or this mystic side of it, these are the types of people that really like to gravitate towards these secret society groups, the ones seeking power. And it's the same thing in politics too. It's the same type of personality traits, only displayed slightly differently. Many of those are involved in the occult orders as well in politics. Many of the people that have made themselves lifelong politicians or have put themselves in the offices of power behind the scenes for life belong to many of these secret society groups and occult fraternities. And they relish in the power and influence that they have because they have this personality type. But enough about that. Let's continue reading here. In his final year at Cambridge, at age of 33, go figure, Crowley met and fell in love with Jerome Pollitt. Pollitt was 10 years his senior, a close friend of Aubrey Beardsley's, and a talented female impersonator and dancer who had performed as Diane de Rogy in tribute to the actress Liane de Pougy. In spite of the cautionary tone of Crowley's account of the affair, and his insistence that his sexual life remained intensely heterosexual, he conceded that their relationship was, quote, that ideal intimacy which the Greeks considered the greatest glory of manhood and the most precious prize of life, end quote. Gonna pause for a moment there, folks. So, this is what this whole push for all of this deviant sexuality in the modern era is about. It falls back on the same type of spirit, essentially. This has grabbed hold of our society in many ways. It's affected the minds of too many in this world. And the vast majority don't want to see this stuff pushed and elevated in the way that it has been through Hollywood and various of the other circles of influence in our culture. But this is exactly why this kind of thing is happening, because it brings about a type of power over others and influence over others in certain ways, and they idealize this, and they do so by quoting back about the Greeks. We've heard this, right? They talk about that all the time to justify it, to make it seem like, oh, it's okay, it's always been a natural part of human society. And this kind of downplays the sinful nature of it, but that's neither here nor there. Let's continue reading. Later, he immortalized Pollitt in The Scented Garden of Abdullah the Satirist, also a tribute of sorts to Richard Burton's translated work, The Perfumed Garden. Crowley's collection of poems are a blend of Persian mysticism and the glorification of homosexual love, written in the style of ghazals by an imaginary 17th century poet. They are supposedly translated into English by an Anglo-Indian, Major Luidi, helped by an anonymous editor, and are then discussed by an equally fictitious clergyman. The collection, however, is typically Crowley-esque, both spoofs and serious, learned in its own way, while designed to amuse. Beginning, quote, "As I placed the rigid pen of my thought within the inkstand of my imagination, I tasted the bliss of Allah," end quote. The poet Abdullah al-Haji, the El-Kahir of the Ghazals, praises the podex of his lover Habib. More notable than the explicit meaning of the verses are the hidden references to Pollitt and to Crowley himself. In the closing sections of the book, the name of Herbert Charles Jerome Pollitt is spelled out in the first letter of each line, to be followed, but in reverse order, by that of Aleister Crowley. So I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. Do you see how narcissistic this guy was? He thought he was so much smarter and better than everybody. He wrote his own poetry. He wrote his own stories. He was a very creative guy. Let's give him that. He was well written, well read, well versed in many things. But he was, like I said, a total narcissist and a total manipulator. And he was one of these types that really loved to get one over on people. And this is the kind of trick that he would pull, something like this, where he would spell out the names in the first letter of each verse of the poem here in that way. Takes a lot of creativity and imagination to do that, don't get me wrong, but what kind of emotional state are you in to do something like that? And this guy was manipulative through and through. Let's continue on. But Crowley's relationship with Pollitt, while intense, was not the sole source of meaning or diversion in his life. Pollitt introduced Crowley to the decadent movement, and in Crowley's words, made a poet out of him, but he had little sympathy with the younger man's growing occult interests and did not share his passion for mountaineering. During the Cambridge vacations, Crowley went climbing in the Alps, achieving a lone ascent of the Eiger, and began to read widely on esoteric subjects. Inspired by the apparent allusion to a hidden church in A.E. Waite's Book of Black Magic and of Pacts, Crowley wrote to Waite requesting further information. Waite responded by recommending that Crowley read the occult classic The Cloud Upon the Sanctuary by Counselor von Eckartshausen, which had recently been translated by Isabel de Steiger. The book duly accompanied him on a climbing and walking holiday during the Easter vacation of 1898. Crowley discovered that Eckartshausen indeed elaborated on Waite's theme, describing a secret sanctuary and a hidden community of saintly beings who possessed the keys to the mysteries of the universe. From that moment, Crowley determined to find and enter into communication with this mysterious brotherhood. Quote, I longed passionately for illumination, for perfect purity of life, for mastery of the secret forces of nature, end quote. So I'm going to pause for a moment there, folks. So he longed for illumination, mastery of the secret forces of nature, mastery of the forces of nature. What does that tell you? The guy was looking for power. Power. Let's read on. Crowley perceived his aspirations as religious. Certainly his preoccupation at the time with the origin of evil and the nature of Satan suggested they might be, but from the outset there was also the issue of power and control. Magic, like mountaineering, was in some respects the perfect answer to the desire for mastery of the forces, secret or otherwise, of nature, and he now gave himself over to his magical studies. Pollitt was rapidly seen as inimical to these researches, and Crowley ended the relationship shortly after going down from Cambridge in the early summer of 1898. Crowley was later to recognize this as an imbecile mistake, and it remained a cause of permanent regret. In 1898, however, he was utterly focused, white-hot, on his several ambitions: climbing, poetry, and the pursuit of magical knowledge. Now, a wealthy young man in his own right, he was free to pursue his interests, and several meetings that year were to further them. At Easter, he had met Oscar Eckenstein, one of the finest mountaineers in England, and a man whom Crowley deeply admired. Eckenstein taught him a great deal about mental discipline, and they went on to climb together in major expeditions. About the same time, he met Gerald Kelly, a painter, who was later to be elected to the Royal Academy, and his future brother-in-law. Gonna pause for a moment there, folks. What do you know? The Royal Academy and Crowley's future brother-in-law. Go figure, right? Gee, it's amazing how all this stuff always seems to happen within these little same circles, isn't it? Let's read on. Kelly, unlike Eckenstein, shared Crowley's interest in magic and was to travel along that path in Crowley's company. A chance meeting that summer, however, was possibly the most auspicious. By this time, Crowley had advanced to Samuel Liddell McGregor Mather's Kabbalah unveiled and was disposed to brag about his occult knowledge. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Brag about his occult knowledge. He bragged about it. Don't these people... isn't that one of their mantras that they're supposed to eliminate their ego, void their own ego? This guy was egoic. All about himself, bragging rights. He also bragged about all of the very many Masonic badges and awards and all of these different things that all these secret society groups were to give him, that he was due. All of these things he had allegedly earned. He bragged about this. He bragged that the weight of all those medals and stuff that he would have conferred upon him, were he to try to wear them all at once, would be enough weight to crush an elephant. He would brag this. You know how he got most of those awards? Most of those notorieties, or most of those degrees and those honors and distinguished awards from these various secret society groups? Well, we covered this in another episode, but largely most of them came when he was actually taken to court for using a Rosicrucian ceremony in one of his books that he wrote. So, and he was taken to court by the head of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, and those other fraternities that claimed to be the real Rosicrucians, because they all claimed to be the real Rosicrucians, they decided that they would shower him with all these various degrees and honorary titles and so forth, because they wanted him to come over and maybe give away some of the secrets that he knew about this other fraternity. So, so that's how he earned all of those, and he liked to brag about those. So anyway, let's continue on. Enough about that. One evening in Zermatt, while taking a respite from climbing, he met and conversed with an analytical chemist named Julian L. Baker, a man who clearly knew more than Crowley about the occult. Upon their return to England, Baker introduced Crowley to George Cecil Jones, also a chemist and, like Baker, a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Crowley was subsequently introduced to McGregor Mathers, presumably made a favorable impression, and was duly initiated on 18 November 1898 as Frater Perdurabo, which means I will endure, in the neophyte grade of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. In spite of dismissing most of the order's initiates as muddled middle-class mediocrities, Crowley was convinced that he had found and entered the hidden church of the Holy Grail. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So here it is. He thinks he found the secret brotherhood that he was searching for. You know, those secret brothers who run things in the world. In the Order of the Golden Dawn here. So let's continue on. Crowley therefore persevered with what he considered disappointingly dull and elementary studies, and was advanced to the grade of Philosophus in May of 1899. He had now reached the top grade of the First Order, and fully expected to be invited to join the tantalizing Second or Inner Order. About this time, Crowley met Alan Bennett, an honored magician in the Golden Dawn, whose magical powers were considered second only to those of MacGregor Mathers. Bennett approached Crowley after a Golden Dawn ceremony and accused him of dabbling in malignant forces beyond his control. Crowley, who had indeed been secretly studying the demonic system known as Abramelin magic, gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Abramelin the mage. This is we discussed this on a previous program too. That this was a text that dates back to the 15th century, if I'm not mistaken. And this was a magical system put forward by a student of Abramelin. And this was one of the magical systems Crowley was studying that the Golden Dawn didn't appreciate, apparently. But let's continue on here. So Crowley, who had indeed been secretly studying the demonic system known as Abramelin magic, recognized in Bennett an occult master and invited the impoverished magician to stay with him in his comfortable London flat at 67 Chancery Lane. A period of intense magical activity now began. Crowley's flat was fitted out with 2 temples consecrated to magical acts, one white and the other black. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. And there's the Masonic checkerboard. Duality, white and black, right? Let's continue on. Here, Bennett, Jones, and Crowley, in spite of the latter's relatively junior status, began to experiment with advanced magic and evoke spirits in the Abramelin fashion. Bennett also instructed Crowley in the magical use of drugs. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. You don't say these guys use drugs, too, right? Go figure. Never happens, right? Let's continue on. These activities did not find general favor with senior members of the Golden Dawn, and Crowley began to acquire an unsavory reputation as rumors of his flamboyant lifestyle, demonic magic, and homosexuality began to circulate. W.B. Yeats thought Crowley was immoral, if not mad, while Crowley was convinced that Yeats was envious of his literary and magical prowess. Gonna pause for a second there, folks. Another mark of a narcissist. He thought the guy was jealous of him because he was critical of him. Let's continue reading. Nonetheless, MacGregor Mathers overruled the London leadership and initiated Crowley into the Second Order in January of 1900. Crowley, in turn, became involved in a bitter power struggle within the Golden Dawn, subsequently abandoned both the Order and MacGregor Mathers, went on to study with other teachers, and finally established his own magical order in 1907. By then, a great deal had happened to him. Crowley had traveled extensively, broken several climbing records with Eckenstein, and established new ones, married Rose Kelly, and taken her and their new daughter on a grueling trek across China, lost that same daughter to typhoid fever, and was in the process of losing Rose to alcoholism. In 1906, he had returned to the intensive Abramelin magic of his earlier days, resumed his experimentation with drugs, and been recognized by George Cecil Jones as a master magician. Accordingly, Crowley began to work out the details of his own magical order, the Argentium Astrum, or Silver Star, and founded its mouthpiece, the Equinox, an ambitious, well-produced periodical dedicated to the serious discussion of the occult arts. And I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. And it was this publication, the Equinox, where he exposed a Rosicrucian ritual and was taken to court. And this is where he got much of these honorary titles and degrees that he always bragged about, is as a result of this court case. So let's continue on. By 1907, Crowley was in search of a following, and looking to Cambridge for potential recruits, simply turned up one day in Victor Newberg's room at Trinity. Newberg was already a published poet, and Crowley had been attracted by the mystical leanings in his work. Victor Benjamin Newberg was then in his mid-20s, not having gone up to Cambridge until 1906 when he was 23, and his family had finally admitted that he was not cut out for a business career. He came from a comfortable middle-class home in North London and had been raised by his mother following the departure of his father for his native Vienna shortly after the arranged marriage. The bulk of the family money on his mother's side lay with Victor's uncle Edward, who financed his nephew's education and gave his mother a cottage in Sussex as a supplement to the Hove flat to which she had moved in 1903. Victor's family, however, while undoubtedly kind and generous, had little in common with a young man who rejected conventional Judaism along with all organized religion, espoused free-thought views and progressive values, and yet had experienced mystical states since childhood. Crowley, affluent, charming, and urbane, an erudite fellow poet who claimed to understand spiritual realities, held a magnetic appeal for Newburgh. Equally, Crowley immediately recognized in Newburgh an altogether extraordinary capacity for magic, and began to groom him for the benefit of the order and of himself. Crowley thought Newburgh fattish, incurably lazy, and lacking in self-discipline, as well as inhibited and nervous. His answer to some of these shortcomings was vigorous and prolonged physical exertion, combined with a course of extreme mental discipline, important for all embryonic magicians. In the summer of 1908, Crowley took Newburgh on a long tramp across the Pyrenees and down through Spain. Newburgh managed to make it to Madrid before succumbing to illness and exhaustion, but he and Crowley subsequently traveled on to Gibraltar and made the crossing to Tangiers. By the time Newburgh returned to Cambridge for his final year, he had to not only work for his degree in modern languages, but also read his way through the comprehensive corpus of magical, philosophical, mystical, and fictional literature required of any novice in Crowley's Order of the Silver Star. In this order, a seeker first became a student, and then a probationer before advancing to the neophyte grade and beyond, and Newburgh seems to have been a probationer in 1908. Crowley's regimen of magical training was much more demanding than that of the Golden Dawn's first order, but he seemed fairly pleased with his pupil. For his part, Newburgh was convinced that he stood in the shadow of a master, and like Crowley at the turn of the century, on the threshold of a secret brotherhood. The spring of 1909 found Newburgh cramming feverishly for his final examinations at Cambridge, while attending to Crowley's demands. He obtained an adequate third-class degree, and immediately made preparations to join Crowley at Boleskine House, his master's large residence on the shores of Loch Ness in Scotland. Going to pause for a moment there, folks. Which was later bought by Jimmy Page, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't know if Jimmy Page still owns it. I think he's since sold it. But you see the influence that Crowley has had in the modern era. He became a sort of pop culture icon in the 60s as part of the counterculture movement. Was adopted by, various rock groups, appeared on the Beatles album covers and various other things. So we see here the influence had transcended through time, at any rate. But let's continue reading. Newburgh left Cambridge on the 16th of June, 1909, and traveled to Scotland by the night train, accompanied by another Cambridge man, Kenneth Ward. Ward was going only to take up a social invitation and to borrow a pair of Crowley's skis. Whether he knew it or not, Victor Newburgh was destined for quite a different experience. Upon his arrival at Boleskine, Newburgh was informed that he was to undertake a magical retirement, a withdrawal from the world during which, as Crowley made clear, he must make a serious attempt to access and explore the astral light. Accordingly, on the 18th of June, this young and inexperienced fledgling magician took his place in a specially prepared chamber at Boleskine, and began what was to prove to be a 10-day period of isolation, marked by extreme discomfort, a certain amount of suffering, and occasional glimpses of ecstatic joy. Throughout, Crowley was almost impossibly testing. He expected Newburgh to make the kind of magical progress in days that took years to achieve in the Golden Dawn, and to do this while existing in Spartan conditions with little food to sustain him. The young probationer was made to sleep naked on a bed of gorse for a week, and early in the retirement, Crowley visited the shivering Newburgh at night and scourged him with a bundle of nettles. Later, dissatisfied with his progress, Crowley gave him 32 strokes with a switch of gorse and drew blood. Presumably, this was not the sole purpose of these nocturnal visits. The probationer noted in his meticulous written record that Crowley, quote, is apparently a homosexual sadist, and he performed the ceremony with obvious satisfaction, end quote. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So, does this sound like somebody that is really a powerful magician? Somebody that has the best interests of humanity in mind? Does this sound like the person that's going to usher in the new age? If this is what the new age has in store, I don't think anybody wants any part of it, right? This kind of treatment and thinking. Let's continue on. Gorse has strong prickles and nettles sting, but the young man had taken a holy vow of obedience to his magical master. It is a small wonder that Newberg attributed an emissio seminer to anxiety. Crowley's attitude was clearly not that of a disinterested teacher. It also represented part of a complex and ritualized playing out of elements of his personal relationship with Newberg. He chastised the probationer, but in terms that related to the man. Crowley afterwards expressed the view that there was a fundamental moral deficiency in his character and a strain of racial congenital cowardice too deeply seated for eradication. I'm going to pause for a minute here, folks. So this guy is making moral judgments on others. Keep that in mind, too. Let's continue on. At the time, he continually harped upon the student's supposed racial, that is, Jewish traits, and Newberg found the personal abuse almost intolerable. He went through periods of rebellion, but in awe of Crowley, bound to him emotionally, and cognizant of his vow, Newberg always repented of his outbursts. The racial slurs and personal insults continued. Meanwhile, however, Newberg began to have some magical success. Prolonged periods of yoga and meditation began to facilitate changed states of consciousness, and these in turn gave way to vivid experiences on the astral planes. Moments of supreme spiritual insight, of intense and rapturous identification with the cosmic mind, were equaled by episodes of horrifying despair. But Newberg emerged from the storm to find a sense of peace and harmony, and seemed to find within himself some kind of center. He understood that at some level this sense of center accorded with the magician's will, the essential focal point for all magical activity. Crowley approved the insight, commenting that this approached a description of initiated consciousness. In Newberg's account of his retirement, dated 29th of June, 1909, he thanked his most holy guru, and fittingly both praised and blamed him. Crowley then advanced his probationer to the grade of neophyte. So I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So that's a lot of heavy stuff, isn't it, that this guy went through. This is how Crowley trained people in the magical arts, by doing really ugly things to them and claiming that this is how you achieve the magical powers, is through this type of abuse. He espoused racist viewpoints. He espoused various other viewpoints here. He judged this guy as being immoral and lazy, but this was his student, his chosen student, correct? So this kind of thing. I mean, what justification, what right does he have to morally judge others? He's not a bastion of morality himself in this context here. But you see how the student will do whatever he says because he's just in awe of his magical prowess or alleged magical prowess and this kind of thing. It's almost like one of those cases where, you know, you will cling to your abuser. We have that Stockholm Syndrome thing going on in this as well. So this Newberg guy stuck with Crowley through this. And now we're going to get into some of the more interesting aspects of things here. let's read on because there's still a lot of ground to cover. North Africa. Crowley and Newberg traveled to London at the beginning of July and there set about bringing out the second issue of The Equinox. But there was more than the production of his occult periodical on Crowley's mind. His divorce proceedings were coming to a head. Crowley claimed that divorce was inevitable because Rose refused to seek treatment for her alcoholism. She was later incarcerated, suffering from alcoholic dementia, but that he had done the gentlemanly thing by providing his wife with evidence of adultery so that she could appear as the plaintiff. Nevertheless, Crowley was anxious to be out of the country by the autumn of 1909, as the trial was pending. He decided upon North Africa and maintained that he had no specific magical purpose in mind when he set out on the trip. He loved that region and simply wanted to roam at will. Accordingly, and accompanied by Frater Omnia Vincam, a neophyte of the AA, the Argentium Astrum, disguised as Victor Newberg, Crowley left England and duly arrived in Algiers on the 17th of November. Here he undoubtedly evinced the unmistakable subtly superior air of the English gentleman abroad. On arrival, Crowley's attitude toward colonial French officialdom was one of polite disdain. He chose to ignore warnings that an unaccompanied trip through the desert could be dangerous. Instead, confident and at ease, every inch the seasoned traveler, he immediately set about buying the necessary provisions for a journey. Crowley claimed to have a basic grasp of Arabic and understood a fair amount about Muslim culture, but was concerned that the physically slight Victor Newberg, with his hand-dog look, would undermine his credibility. His remedy was surprising. On Crowley's insistence, Newberg's head was shaved, leaving only 2 tufts at the temple that were twisted up into horns. Crowley laughingly but tellingly comments that his Chila was thus transformed into, quote, a demon that I had tamed and trained to serve me as a familiar spirit. This greatly enhanced my eminence, end quote. Gonna pause for a moment there, folks. So, I don't think I need to point out this whole narcissistic tendency of Crowley again. This was truly an evil man, okay? Let's make no doubts about that. He wasn't misunderstood. He was a psychopath, okay? Let's read on. The 2 men then took the tram to Arba and set out on a tramp through the desert. Crowley and Newberg reached Amail on the 21st of November after spending 2 nights sleeping under the stars. Here, Crowley had the sudden insight that he must renew a magical undertaking begun in Mexico 9 years earlier. Although he denied premeditation, Crowley had brought with him various magical accoutrements, including a vermilion wooden cross set with a large golden topaz. The magical operation that he had in mind relied on a complex magical system developed by John Dee, the eminent Elizabethan mathematician and astrologer, and his clairvoyant Edward Kelly. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. You may have heard of John Dee and Edward Kelly. These were the guys that developed what's called Goetia, or Goetia is the best way to pronounce it, I suppose, or the Goetic magical arts. They put together the lesser book of Solomon, the greater book of Solomon. These are magical texts that allegedly talk about ways in which to summon 72 different demons, this kind of thing. They worked up this whole system, Dee and Kelly. And this is what Crowley had in mind here. So let's go ahead and continue reading. Dee and Kelly were well versed in practical Kabbalah and experimented with the angel magic of the Renaissance magician Henry Cornelius Agrippa. Agrippa had elaborated a system of numerical and alphabetical tables for the summoning of angels, and it was within this framework that the 2 Elizabethans worked. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Angels. That's what they claim to be. These are more of the fallen angelic types, though. I think they would more readily classify in what we would consider in classic theological studies, demons. But let's continue on. I don't want to mince words or anything here. We'll just go with what the author's saying here, and you can make your own judgments on that. Agrippa had elaborated a system of numerical and alphabetical tables for the summoning of angels, and it was within this framework that the two Elizabethans worked. John Dee used Kelly's gifts as an expert scryer, one who could travel in the many realms of spirit existence, to vicariously enter into conversation with the angels in order to tempt from them the secrets of the universe. Dee asked his questions through Kelly and duly recorded the results. During their lengthy seances, Kelly would, quote, scry in the spirit vision, end quote, using a shoe stone in much the same way as a seer might use a crystal ball. It was Kelly who saw the angel in the stone and communicated its message to Dee. If the instruction concerned a magical invocation or call, the angel dictated it in reverse, as it was considered too powerful to simply replicate. In 1583, the angels began to give their communications in an angelic secret language known as Enochian. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks, invoking the idea of Enoch from the Bible. Enochian, that's what this language became known as here. Let's continue on. And the information was recorded in a complex grid form. Over time, Dee built up an entire cosmology of angels and demons and sketched out 30 ethers or airs, realms of otherworldly existence. This schema, probably reworked by MacGregor Mathers, had been integrated into the teachings of the Order of the Golden Dawn. Although he had been denied entry to the Second Order, Crowley had studied with other senior Golden Dawn adepts, most notably Alan Bennett, and was familiar with Dee's system. But whereas Golden Dawn initiates were set to study Dee's so-called Enochian system as a scholarly exercise, Crowley was prepared to test its efficacy. He had made a faithful copy of Dee's 19 calls, or keys, which called upon powerful occult forces, and had experimented with the 19th call in Mexico. Now, in Amelie, he felt impelled to resume this magical operation. Crowley considered himself a master of astral travel, and was in the process of teaching its necessary techniques and procedures to Newburgh. He felt that the conditions were perfect for undertaking a journey through John Dee's ethers. Crowley's technique was simple. He would select a secluded spot and recite the appropriate call, the ritual incantation that would give him access to the relevant ether. After satisfying himself that the invoked forces were present, Crowley would take up his magical shoe stone, in this case the large golden topaz, and scry in the spirit vision much as Kelly had done centuries before. He made the topaz play a part not unlike that of the looking glass in the case of Alice. By making the relevant call and concentrating on the topaz, Crowley could enter the ether. He was clear about what this meant. He said, quote, "When I say I was in any ether, I simply mean in the state characteristic of and peculiar to its nature," end quote. In other words, Crowley recognized that this was a similar experience to that of astral travel. It was conducted within his own mind. Gonna pause for a moment there, folks. And I think that may be all you need to know about much of these teachings in the occult fraternities. It's all in their own mind. So, are they really traveling other planes? Or are their minds being manipulated by spiritual forces they don't understand? Or is it their own imaginations running wild? You decide. You make that decision. Use your discernment. You discern for yourself what you think is the true nature of these things. Are they really doing the things they claim? Is this really the nature of it? Let's continue on, though. Having accessed the ether, He would describe his experiences to Newberg, who would write them down. It is noteworthy that typically Crowley adapted the procedure to suit himself. Unlike Dee, he, the master magician, would be his own scryer. Victor Newberg, whom Crowley recognized as a gifted clairvoyant, was to be merely the scribe. As the two men made their way through the desert, Crowley increasingly fell under the spell of his experiences in Dee's ethers. He encountered celestial beings, both terrible and beautiful, who divulged in richly symbolic language something of the realms in which they dwelt. Crowley understood much of the symbolism and began to realize that the calls did indeed give the scryer access to an intricate but cogent and coherent universal system of other worlds and beings. He was satisfied that whereas he saw visions and heard voices, he was not the autonomous author of his experiences. I saw with my own eyes and heard with my own ears the truth. These visions thus crystallized in dramatic form the theoretical conclusion which my studies of comparative religion had led me to adumbrate. End quote. Crowley fully intended the calls to be an impersonal exploration of the ethers and was convinced that he was being shown the, quote, shining simplicity, end quote, of cosmic truths. But he gradually became aware that he was personally implicated at another level. The magical work was working on him. As the calls proceeded, Crowley began increasingly to feel something very akin to fear. It was as though, he says, a hand was holding his heart, while a whispering breath enveloped him in words both awful and enchanting. In a gender reversal that was to typify much of this magical experience, Crowley reveals that he began to feel, well, not exactly frightened. It was the subtle trembling of a maiden before the bridegroom. In order to fortify himself against growing feelings of awe and dread, he began to recite the Quran as he marched across the desert. The great stretches of empty landscape, hot by day and icy at night, and continuous intoning of magical and religious formulae combined to effect a state of almost overwhelming spiritual intensity. A little over 2 weeks after arriving in Algiers, Crowley and Newberg reached Bausada. This isolated haven in the desert, with its palm trees, gardens, and orchards, was where the desert road ran out. Bausada gave the impression of a last link with civilization. Some distance from the town was a mountain, Mount Dala Adin. It was here that Crowley, acting on instructions from previous angelic interlocutors, made the appropriate call and attempted to enter the 14th ether. He encountered a thick black veil that, try as he might, he could not penetrate. All the while a voice spoke of Crowley as one about to enter the kingdom of the grave. As he struggled with the blackness, a great earthquake rent the veil, and Crowley saw an all-glorious angel standing in front of him with his arms outstretched and head thrown back. The angel had a star upon his forehead, but he was surrounded with blackness and the crying of beasts. The angel instructed Crowley to withdraw, the mystery of the 14th ether being so great and terrible, it cannot be revealed in sight of the sun. Shaken, Crowley prepared to return to Bausada. As he did so, suddenly came the command to perform a magical ceremony on the summit of the mountain. Whatever form the command took, Crowley experienced it as absolute. He and Newberg responded by building a great circle with loose rocks. They inscribed the circle with magical words of power, erected an altar in its midst, and there, in Crowley's words, quote, I sacrificed myself. The fire of the all-seeing sun smote down upon the altar, consuming every particle of my personality, end quote. Gonna pause for a moment there, folks. Yeah, right. So you see here, these are the claims made by Aleister Crowley, recorded by Newberg. He was telling him his dreams and visions that he had here, these experiences. They did these things, they did these rituals, and I'd imagine it was probably Newberg sitting there in a circle, probably pretty sleepy, falling asleep, watching the guy sitting there in a meditative type trance. And that's about it. And then he would occasionally wake up and tell him some weird thing that he saw in his dream. So, and this is magic, folks. This is what they claim. These are the things they teach within these secret occult fraternities. These are the types of mystical powers you can have. And is there anything really to them? Could you really experience these spiritual worlds, these spiritual realms? Can you see in them? Can you travel through them? You have to wonder. There's no way to really prove it or disprove it. But seeing the personality traits of Crowley to begin with, do you really believe anything he's telling you? This guy is a master manipulator. He's a narcissist. He's a psychopath. He's clearly unstable. He's done drugs, had drug addictions, and various other things that were well known. So, any altered states of consciousness he was in, is this really a good type of spiritual experience, an enlightenment per se? And this is the kind of thing that they promote within these secret society groups. But let's continue on, because I want to get through some more of this, and we only have about 15 minutes left. Crowley says simply in his confessions that what took place amounted to a final tearing away of, quote, certain conceptions of conduct which, while perfectly proper from the standpoint of my human nature, end quote, he had regarded as, quote, impertinent to initiation, end quote. What happened in prosaic terms was that Crowley was sodomized by Newberg in a homosexual rite offered to the god Pan. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Pan. If you've been following my work for any length of time, you know I wrote a book called The Demic of Pan, Breaking the Natural Order, which very much is the same archetype that was being invoked here by Crowley and Newberg. Maybe this was the spirit guiding this. And I also pointed out something that I called the Pan-Christ dynamic, which is something that can be used as a signal for the emergence of a new age, the switching between ages, this crossover period in the energetic principles. So, at any rate here, they offered up a homosexual rite offered to the god Pan. Let's continue on. Pan, the man-goat, had a particular significance for the two men. Not only did Crowley revere him as the diabolical god of lust and magic, but Newberg literally had what acquaintances described as an elfin and faun-like appearance. It is likely that what happened on Mount Dala Adin was a classic invocation. The young Chila, in accordance with accepted magical technique, probably called down or invoked the god Pan. A successful invocation would result in the neophytes becoming, quote, inflamed, end quote, by the power of the god. If this is what happened during the ceremony on the mountain, Newberg, in his magical capacity, would momentarily identify with all that the man-goat god represented. Put simply, Newberg, with his tufted horns, would become Pan, the faun-like yet savage lover of Crowley's psychosexual world. This may well have been the first time that Crowley, and certainly Newberg, had performed a magical homosexual act, although Crowley quickly came to believe that sex magic was an unrivaled means to great power. Conversely, the image of Pan was to haunt Victor Newberg for the rest of his life. It inspired some of his best early poetry, but later filled him with dread. The experience was overwhelming for both men, but it temporarily devastated Crowley. His summation was brief. There was an animal in the wilderness, quote, end quote, he writes, quote, but it was not I, end quote. Crowley remembered nothing of his return to Bausada. As he slowly came to himself, however, he knew that he was changed. And now we're going to quote him here. Quote, I knew who I was and all the events of my life, but I no longer made myself the center of their sphere. I did not exist. All things were alike as shadows sweeping across the still surface of a lake. Their images had no meaning for the water, no power to stir its silence." End quote. Crowley felt that he had ceremonially crossed the abyss, a term reminiscent of Nietzsche, whom Crowley greatly admired. I'm going to pause for a second. No kidding. Let's continue on, though. But denoting the last terrible journey that a magician must make before he could justifiably lay claim to the highest levels of adeptship, Master of the Temple, a grade of enlightened initiation achieved in Crowley's own magical order, only after crossing the abyss, meant renunciation of all that life meant. The Order of the Golden Dawn taught that such awareness could not be accessed this side of death, and Crowley affirmed this in his own way. The angel of the 14th ether had warned him that the Master of the Temple is condemned to darkness. Crowley, in turn, taught that becoming a Master of the Temple implied not simply symbolic death and rebirth, a concept familiar to all magical initiates, but the annihilation of the personal self. The abyss, then, was closely associated with the death of the individual, although not necessarily on the physical level. Gonna pause for a moment there, folks. So here you go. It's all about the destruction, the annihilation of the personal self, the I am. This giving over of yourself to something else. Sound a little creepy? Probably should. But not necessarily on the physical level. What spirit indwelled Crowley? You see, in Christian religion, we're said that we are indwelt by the Holy Spirit. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God? Well, what kind of a temple did Crowley become in doing all of this? What is the temple of transhumanism? What spirit resides in the transhumanist temple, as it were? Same kind of thing, just on a different type of approach, as it were, here, using science. And remember, Crowley taught what he called, what did they call it? Scientific illumination. That's what he called it, as part of his system of the Argenteum Astrum. Scientific illumination. Skeptical theurgy. This is how he referred to these. So, denial of the existence of God the Creator. And deifying science as the be-all, end-all. This is the exact spirit of transhumanism. Exactly, one for one. But let's not harbor too long on that. I've only got a few minutes left here, and I still want to cover some ground. Let's continue on. A few days later, Crowley, who in the aftermath of the sacrifice on Mount Dala Adin had already acknowledged that at one level, quote, I did not exist, end quote, prepared formally to undergo the abyss ordeal. He understood that he would do so when he entered John Dee's 10th ether, and knew that while there, he must meet and defeat the terrible Kuranzan, the mighty devil that inhabiteth the outermost abyss. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. We might do a show about Kuranzan at some point, represented by the number 333. The guardian of the veil, the guardian of the threshold. Anyway, let's continue on. He also knew that he could do so only as Perdurabo, a magical adept, and that it was paramount that he applied the lesson of the 14th ether. No shred of ego must remain if he was to survive the experience unscathed. Success depended on Crowley's ability to master Kuranzan through the dominating power of the magical will. The complex techniques, rituals, and paraphernalia of magical practice are the means by which a magician develops and inflames his will, the single most important attribute of a magician. Gonna pause for a moment there, folks. I'm going to repeat that last sentence. The complex techniques, rituals, and paraphernalia of magical practices are the means by which a magician develops and inflames his will, the single most important attribute of a magician. So there you go. When you're talking about the will, this is what it's talking about. It's the single most important attribute of a magician. If you have stronger will than somebody else, this is what it's all about. Full spectrum dominance. And where have we heard that before? Let's continue reading. Crowley understood that Karanzan's power could be bound and brought under control only through the silent but relentless application of the magical will, and that this was critical for a successful crossing of the abyss. Failure to force Karanzan into submission would enslave the magician to him, corrupting every subsequent undertaking and bringing disaster in its wake. Given this and the warnings he had received in the previous ethers, Crowley changed his magical procedure. On the 6th of December, 1909, Crowley and Newberg left Bausada and went far out into the desert until they found a suitable valley in the dunes. Here they traced a circle in the sand, inscribing it with the various sacred names of God. A triangle was then traced nearby, its perimeters likewise inscribed with divine names and also with that of Karanzan. This was correct magical practice. The magic circle provided protection for the magician. The triangle of art was intended to contain any visible manifestation of the forces called up or evoked by Perdurabo. And I'm going to pause for a second here, folks, and notice that he will take on his magical mantle now, Perdurabo. This name he was given in the Golden Dawn system. There's a reason they changed their names, and this has to do with a concept called the true name. Whereas if you know an entity's true name, you have control over it. I think it has something to do with that. But let's continue reading. The process of evocation was designed to produce a physical materialization of, in this case, the demonic inhabitant of the abyss. 3 pigeons were sacrificed and their blood placed at the 3 corners of the triangle. Crowley took particular care that it remained within the confines of the figure so that it would facilitate and help sustain any physical manifestation. At this point, Newberg entered the circle. He was armed with a magic dagger and had strict instructions to use it if anything, even anything that looked like Crowley, attempted to break into the circle. At Crowley's instigation, Newberg swore an oath to defend its inviolability with his life. Crowley, dressed in his ceremonial black robe, then made an astonishing departure from accepted ritual practice. No kidding. Let's continue on. Instead of joining his Chila in the relative safety of the circle, he entered the triangle of art. While Newberg performed the banishing rituals of the pentagram and hexagram, a procedure designed to protect him, Crowley made the call of the 10th ether. The mighty Karanzan announced himself from within the shoe stone with a great cry, Zasas, Zasas, Nastanda Zasas. I am I. From me come leprosy and pox and plague and cancer and cholera and the falling sickness. I will reach up to the knees of the Most High and tear his phallus with my teeth, and I will bray his testicles in a mortar and make poison thereof to slay the sons of men. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. This is what this entity allegedly told Crowley. So this is this Karanzan that he claims here as the 10th ether, the crossing the barrier here, the crossing of the abyss. This is where Crowley claims he has done something that has never been done before by any other in doing this. Let's continue on, and we'll see what he's talking about before we wrap it up. Crowley probably uttered these words. Thereafter, however, as far as Newberg could tell, Crowley fell silent. He remained seated in the triangle in the sand, robed and hooded, deeply withdrawn. So I'm going to pause for a second. Hold on. So apparently, I guess those were the things that Crowley said out loud. So I guess speaking as this Karanzan to the witness at Newberg there, sitting over in the circle. All right, so he had remained hooded, robed and hooded, deeply withdrawn, and did not move or speak during the ceremony. No kidding. It was Newberg who both heard and saw. Unlike the previous calls, when he had acted merely as a scribe, Newberg now beheld not Crowley seated within the triangle, but all that Crowley conjured. Before him appeared Karanzan in the guise of a beautiful woman whom he had known and loved in Paris, and she tried to lure him from the circle. She was followed by a holy man and a serpent. Slowly, the demon in his various manifestations managed to engage the inexperienced Newberg in discussion, and then proceeded to mock him. Had he not, O talkative one, been instructed to hold no converse with the mighty Karanzan? Undoubtedly Newberg had been so instructed by Crowley, but in the heat of the moment forgot himself. During the intense debate that ensued, with Victor Newberg scribbling furiously as to record every detail, Karanzan began stealthily to erase the protective edges of the circle in the sand. Suddenly, Karanzan sprang from the triangle into the circle and wrestled Newberg to the ground. The scribe found himself struggling with a demon in the shape of a naked savage, a strong man, who tried to tear out his throat with froth-covered fangs. Newberg, invoking the magical names of God, struck out with his dagger and finally forced the writhing figure back into the triangle. The Chila repaired the triangle, or the circle, and Karanzan resumed his different manifestations and ravings. Cajoling, tempting, decrying, pleading, he continued to debate and attempt to undermine the scribe. Finally, the manifestations began to fade, and the triangle emptied. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So this is allegedly what Newberg saw. Wonder what kind of drugs he was on at the time, too. Who knows? Who knows? As I always caution you, you have to take this stuff with a grain of salt. This is coming from two men who are obviously manipulators, obviously involved with dark things, and who obviously were interested in power over others. And they were the only two witnesses there to this stuff, so could you believe this story? Maybe there's something to it, maybe there's not. Let's continue on, and then we're going to wrap up. Newberg now became aware of Crowley, who was sitting alone in the triangle. He watched as Crowley wrote the name Babylon, signifying the defeat of Karanzan, in the sand with his holy ring. The ceremony was concluded. It had lasted over 2 hours. The two men lit a green fire of purification and obliterated the circle and the triangle. They had undergone a terrible ordeal. Crowley states that he had astrally identified himself with Karanzan throughout, and had experienced each anguish, each rage, each despair, each insane outburst. Newberg, however, had held forbidden converse with the dweller of the abyss. Both men now felt that they understood the nature of the abyss. It represented dispersion, a terrifying chaos in which there was no center and no controlling consciousness. Its fearsome dweller was not an individual, but the personification of a magnitude of malignant forces made manifest through the massed energy of the evoking magician. But to experience these forces at the most immediate and profoundly personal level, and to believe, as Newberg did, that he had been involved in a fight to the death with them, was shattering. As Crowley remarked, quote, "I hardly know how we ever got back to Bausada," end quote. Over the next 2 weeks, Crowley and Newberg continued the calls as they made their way towards Biskra, a desert journey of over 100 miles. Some of Crowley's experiences in the ethers were lyrical hymns of beauty and ecstasy, but others seemed full of foreboding, suggesting that he had stumbled into a world for which he was not yet prepared. By the time they reached Biskra on the 16th of December, Crowley knew that he was perilously close to the absolute limit of his powers. 4 days later, he concluded the final call. The magical work was finished. The two men were utterly exhausted, but not by the hardships of the physical journey, which Crowley, at least, found delightful. It was the magical experience that had taken its toll. Those who knew them said that Newberg, quote, bore the marks of this magical adventure to the grave, end quote, and that Crowley, shattered psychologically, never recovered from the ordeal. The two men recuperated in Biskra before returning to Algiers Then they sailed for England on the last day of December 1909. So we're going to stop right there, folks. There's more to tell about this, but the whole notion here is Crowley claims that through this ritualistic use of John Dee's system and through crossing this abyss and confronting this Karanzan demonic spirit, allegedly, that he became the master of the temple, this highly sought title to the magicians, the most powerful magician ever. These were the claims that he made, and he was not psychologically sound. As we've seen, I mean, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that, he would be identified as a schizophrenic or some such thing today, as well as classic narcissistic personality disorder, as well as, just sociopathic tendencies, psychopathic tendencies. He was not mentally well to begin with. You mix in drugs and lust for power and all of these different things, and it's a recipe for disaster. And this guy, he was seeking to achieve all of this power, and he saw this magic, these secret brotherhoods, these secret society groups, and the use of this magic as a means to do so, to achieve this power. It's also a known commodity that he also, for a time, worked for MI6 or MI5, I forget which one, but the British intelligence. He worked for British intelligence for a time. So this guy was well connected. This guy was a bit of a loose cannon, a bit of a psychopath. He used and manipulated people for his own greedy ends, and yet he claims to be the arbiter of the message for the new age, this new era, the era of the crowned and conquering child, as he liked to call it, the age of Horus. The old ways are gone, and he has the new law. This is what he claims from a channeled communication from a higher being, his higher guardian angel, as it were, as he claimed. So, his higher self. So, we have all of these different claims, and there's just always been this whole mythology that's arisen around Crowley. So, you have to take this stuff with a grain of salt and understand this guy was disturbed. The things he did were disturbing, and he made claims with no evidence, and people still today revere this guy and take his claims at face value, even though there's no true evidence of anything he said. And he lifted much of these teachings, these magical knowledges from other cultures and teachings from different places, and presented them as his own, and modified them into his own religion of sorts called Thelema, and based it upon some of these alleged magical experiences, or psychedelic experiences as they were. And this is what's taught in a lot of the modern occultism. And people say that this is not evil or bad or any such thing, that Crowley was just misunderstood. Well, I'll let you discern for yourselves. Anyway, that's all for tonight, folks. We'll catch you next time. Have a good night. Discover the amazing, clinically proven health benefits of original Tahitian noni. Original Tahitian noni includes powerful antioxidants, adaptogens, nutrients, and phytonutrients to naturally boost energy levels, immune system function, and overall health. Meticulously sourced from French Polynesia, this is the original superfruit. Accept no imitations. Original Tahitian noni. Visit ATR Health at alchemicaltechrevolution.com. and click on the Shop Here tab for more details.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.